There is a question that seems simple, but it isn't. Why are most psychopaths men? When we think about psychopathy, the image that emerges is almost always male. One cold killer, a calculating manipulator, a silent predator. We rarely imagine a woman when we hear that word. But perhaps the most disturbing thing is not this automatic association. Perhaps most disturbing is what it reveals about us. What if the problem is not just who commits the crimes, but society itself, shapes certain behaviors from an early age? Stop for a second. If psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy, emotional coldness, manipulation, and impulsivity, why do these traits appear more frequently in men? Could it be that the male brain is naturally more prone to cruelty? Or are we looking at the surface and ignoring something much deeper? Before answering, we need to dismantle an illusion. Most people believe that psychopathy is synonymous with extreme violence. But this is an error. Psychopathy is a set of traits, an emotional pattern, a different way of feel or not feel. Not all psychopaths kill. Not all psychopaths go to prison. And maybe you've already lived with one, without knowing it. Studies show that psychopathic traits exist to varying degrees in the population. Some are destructive. Others are functional. There are corporate leaders, politicians, surgeons, and military strategists with high levels of emotional coldness. The difference is not just in the line, it's in the direction he takes. So we return to the question, why do the numbers show more men? Is it biology? Is it culture? Is it power? Or are we measuring wrong? There's an uncomfortable part of this conversation that few want to touch, men in particular. On average, they are encouraged to suppress vulnerable emotions from childhood. Man doesn't cry. Be strong. Swallow it. These phrases seem harmless, but repeated over the years, they build something. They build emotional distance. Now imagine this distance combined with impulsiveness, risk-seeking, and lack of guilt. What emerges from this mixture? But be careful. Being a man does not mean being a psychopath. The overwhelming majority of men never will commit extreme violent or manipulative acts. So what really explains this statistical difference? Could the answer be in the body, in hormones, in the brain? Or are we ignoring the invisible role that culture plays on behavior male? In the next block, we will enter delicate territory. The science. What does biology really say about aggression, empathy, and impulsivity? And is there something about male brain functioning that increases the risk of strokes? Psychopathic. The answer may not be comfortable, but it is necessary. What if part of the explanation lies within the human body itself? If the majority of identified psychopaths are men, the first suspicion lies in about biology. Is there something in the male body that increases the likelihood of emotional coldness? The science starts by looking at a specific hormone, testosterone. Testosterone is associated with the search for dominance, competition, impulsivity, and lower sensitivity to fear. It is not an evil hormone. It is an action hormone, confrontational, risky. Men have, on average, much higher levels of testosterone than women. This, in itself, already influences behavioral patterns since adolescence. More impulsiveness, more physical confrontations, greater risk tolerance. But does this explain psychopathy? Not completely. Another point enters the equation: the cerebral amygdala. The amygdala is a structure linked to the processing of fear and emotional empathy. Studies show that individuals with high psychopathic traits have lower amygdala reactivity when exposed to the suffering of others. In simple terms, their brains react less to suffering. Now imagine combining low emotional reactivity with high impulsivity. The result can be dangerous, but something is still missing. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for moral control and decision-making, also enters in this story. In some psychopaths, this region shows less functional activity. This means less internal braking, less guilt, less anticipation of consequences, less inhibition. Men, on average, mature this region later than women. The maturation male brain is slower, especially in adolescence. This may contribute to greater risky and aggressive behavior during this period. Critical of life. But here's the most important point. Biology is not destiny. Millions of men have high testosterone levels and never hurt anyone. Millions of men are impulsive and yet deeply empathetic. So why do only a portion develop intense psychopathic traits? Because biology creates predisposition, but the environment decides the direction. A brain with less sensitivity to fear can become a great surgeon under pressure, or he may become a remorseless abuser. An individual with high dominance can lead a team, or manipulate people to own benefit. The same biological basis can generate heroes or predators. And here an uncomfortable question arises. If men have a greater biological tendency towards impulsivity and direct aggression, this means that male psychopathy is more visible because it is more physical? Perhaps we are confusing expression with prevalence. Maybe men aren't necessarily more psychopaths, but just express the strokes more explosively. Science points out trends, but it doesn't close the question. Because if biology were the only answer, every culture in the world would present exactly the same standards. And they don't show it. So we need to look at another factor. Social construction. What happens to a boy who learns from an early age that feeling is weakness? What happens when vulnerability is mocked? In the next block, we will leave the laboratory and enter childhood, because perhaps the real ground where male psychopathy begins is not the brain, but the sentences that a boy hears before he even understands what is feeling. Are we, without realizing it, creating emotionally anesthetized men? A boy falls and starts crying. Someone says, "Swallow the crying." Men don't do drama. Be strong. It looks small, but it's not. Male childhood is often silent training for suppression emotional. Vulnerability becomes shame. Sensitivity becomes weakness. Fear becomes a reason laughter. And what happens when emotions cannot be expressed? They don't disappear. They transform. Studies show that girls from an early age receive more encouragement to name feelings. Are you sad? What are you feeling? Boys often receive encouragement to resolve, act, compete. It's not a conspiracy, it's culture. Now imagine a boy with a biological predisposition for impulsiveness, high energy, low frustration tolerance, and he learns that feeling is wrong. He doesn't learn to regulate emotions. He learns to hide them. And when emotions are not regulated, they leak. Sometimes in the form of aggression, sometimes in the form of coldness. Research in developmental psychology indicates that empathy is strengthened by emotional modeling and validation. When adults help children understand what feel, neural circuits linked to compassion are reinforced. But when emotions are ignored or ridiculed, the child can create a layer of protection. A mask. The famous social mask. Now think about this on a collective scale. Millions of boys learning to disconnect from vulnerable feelings. Millions of boys being rewarded for dominance, competition, and control. Are we surprised by the numbers? Psychopathy involves a lack of effective empathy, the ability to feel what someone else feels. If an environment reinforces emotional detachment, it can amplify traits already existing. But be careful. This does not mean that raising tough boys automatically breeds psychopaths. The immense most will not develop severe clinical features. The point is different. Culture can act as a catalyst. A light stroke can become extreme depending on the environment. And there is something even more delicate. Power. Men, historically, occupied more positions of physical and social power. The combination low empathy with power generates greater impact. When a man with features, psychopaths occupy space of authority, the damage can be amplified. This increases visibility, increases stat, increases perception. If you ever heard as a child that you needed to be strong all the time, comment here bottom. I learned to hide. I want to know how many people recognize themselves in this, because maybe this conversation is closer to your story than it seems. But now an even more uncomfortable question arises. And the women? Are they really less psychopathic? Or do they just manifest these traits of different way? Are we looking in the wrong place when we look for female psychopathy? In the next block, we will explore the invisible side of this story, and you might find that danger doesn't always make a sound. When we think of psychopathy, we think of physical violence. But this already reveals a bias. Because violence is not just brute force. There is a form of aggression that does not leave marks on the body, only in the mind, and it tends to be quieter. Research indicates that women with psychopathic traits tend to present levels similar forms of manipulation and lack of guilt, but express this in a different. While psychopathic men are, on average, more prone to direct aggression, women with high psychop traits, addicts, tend to use relational aggression. What does this mean? It means destroying reputations. Socially isolate, manipulate links, explore emotionally, without raising your voice. Psychopathy is not just physical violence. She is emotional coldness, combined with strategy. And strategy doesn't need strength. Some studies suggest that women with psychopathic traits have greater social reading skill. They identify emotional vulnerabilities accurately, and they know where to press. Does this make them less dangerous? Or just less obvious? Most traditional diagnostic criteria were constructed based on populations incarcerated men. Homicides, physical assaults, violent crimes. But if the measuring instrument favors direct aggression, who tends to appear more in the data? Men. This does not mean that women cannot commit violent crimes. They can, and commit. But statistically, they use less extreme physical violence. The difference may be in form, not in essence. There is also an inverse biological factor. Women have, on average, greater activation of brain areas associated with effective empathy. This can act as a moderator natural against violent, impulsive behaviors. But psychopathic traits do not disappear completely. They can be channeled into social settings, fraud, prolonged emotional manipulation, psychological abuse. Have you ever met someone who seemed sweet in public but cruel in private? Someone who silently controlled the people around them? Female psychopathy, when present, tends to operate in the shadows, and this creates a statistical illusion, because what you shout attracts more attention than what you whisper. But here a crucial point arises. If men express psychopathy more visibly, are they really the majority? Or are we confusing volume with frequency? If female aggression is less physical and more psychological, current criteria can capture this difference. Maybe we are looking at the numbers and forgetting to question the method. In the next block, we will enter a sensitive area, the diagnostic instruments themselves. Is science measuring psychopathy through a male lens? What if part of the statistical difference is a consequence of the way we choose to see the problem? There is a question that almost no one asks. What if the difference between men and women in psychopathy isn't just in people, but on the ruler we use to measure? The main clinical instrument to assess psychopathy was developed based on male populations imprisoned for violent crimes, homicides, rapists, aggressors, repeat offenders. In other words, the initial model of a psychopath was shaped by observing extremely violent. This creates a mental pattern. When we think of psychopathy, we think of physical brutality. But psychopathy is broader than that. It involves superficial charm, pathological lie, calculated manipulation, absence of guilt, emotional coldness. Many of these traits can exist without direct physical violence. Now imagine a highly manipulative, remorseless woman who destroys emotionally partners, financially exploits family members, and lies naturally. If she doesn't physically attack, does she fit into the same statistical pattern? Not always. Some researchers suggest that traditional instruments may underestimate the female psychopathy because they value behaviors more common in men: aggression, direct violent criminal history, and physical impulsivity. Meanwhile, indirect aggression and relational manipulation may be given less weight in score. This distorts perception. It doesn't mean that most women are hidden psychopaths, but it means maybe we are only observing part of the picture. There is also another factor. The prison system concentrates more men than women. Like most of the research was carried out inside prisons, the sample naturally favors men. Fewer women incarcerated means fewer women evaluated within these studies' classics, and this feeds the statistical cycle. But here is the most delicate point. Even when we use adjusted instruments, there is still a greater tendency for traces severe psychopathy in men. In other words, it is not just a methodological error. There is a real difference. The question is, how much of this difference is biological, and how much is shaped by opportunities, power, and context. If men have historically had more access to positions of physical strength and authority social, this magnifies the impact of psychopathic traits when they appear. Power enhances traits. Emotional coldness without power is just coldness. Emotional coldness with power can become domination. So maybe the right question isn't just who is more psychopathic. Maybe it's who has the most opportunity for transformation, cold strokes into visible consequences. In the next block, we will abandon statistics. Let's get into the most uncomfortable part of this conversation. Because maybe the real fear isn't knowing why most psychopaths identified are men. Perhaps the fear is realizing that psychopathy is not an isolated phenomenon. It can exist in subtle degrees, in common environments, in apparently normal people. What if what really scares us is not the percentage, but the proximity? After all this, the initial question seems different. Why are most psychopaths men? Perhaps the answer is not unique. There is biology involved. There is culture involved. There is power involved. There is diagnostic bias involved. But there is something even more disturbing. Psychopathy doesn't start with murder. It starts with indifference. It starts when someone doesn't feel guilt, when someone uses people as tools, when someone sees emotions as weakness. And this can exist in mild degrees. Not every psychopath is a criminal. But every psychopath shares one central characteristic: the inability to connect emotionally genuinely. Now think about it calmly. How many people have you met who seemed incapable of feeling true empathy? How many times have you noticed coldness disguised as rationality? How many times do we confuse emotional control with maturity? There is a difference between being strong and being unable to feel. There is a difference between being strategic and being manipulative. Psychopathy is at the extreme end of a human spectrum that we all inhabit at some point. Degree. We all have the capacity for coolness. We can all act out of self-interest. We can all ignore other people's feelings in certain situations. The difference is in the intensity, in frequency, in the absence of guilt. Men appear more in statistics because, on average, they express aggression in a more direct and visible. Because they occupy more positions of power. Because they have greater physical impulsivity. But the essence of psychopathy does not belong to one genre. It belongs to the emotional structure of those who stop feeling the other as human. And perhaps the most disturbing point is this: extreme psychopathy is rare, but cold traits are common. The question that should resonate is not just, why are they men? The question is, are we paying attention to the signs? Are we teaching boys to feel or just to compete? Are we confusing charm with character? Are we prepared to recognize coldness when it doesn't scream? If this content made you think differently about the human mind, sign up. Here we explore what almost no one wants to see. And before you leave, I want you to answer something in the comments. Do you believe that psychopathy is born, or is it built? Because deep down, this answer says a lot more about how you see human beings. And perhaps the scariest thing isn't finding out why most psychopaths identified are men. Perhaps the scariest thing is realizing that the line between normality and extreme coldness is thinner than we would like to admit.